Our two speakers, we're going to have Tom Moroney, who's a member of ARIA's Global Senior Advisory Council, joined by Lyndsee Manna, the EVP of Business Development and Strategic Partnerships at ARIA. They're going to talk to us about the oil industry and how it's a game changer, connecting the data to the decisions with NLG, natural language generation. Tom Moroney is an experienced senior executive with a demonstrated history of working in the oil and energy industry. While at Royal Dutch Shell, Tom managed and led a 150-person organization of engineers, scientists, technologists, technicians, and contractors with associated experimental infrastructure across several geographies and cultures. In this capacity, accountable for all global research and development, innovation, and deployment activities for several flagship technology platforms. Lyndsee Manna is the SVP of Business Development and Partnerships at ARIA NLG. Lyndsee's background includes a career focused around her two biggest passions, which are technology and business strategy. She began her experience in software as a service technology at Diligent Board Member Services as manager of finance, growing Diligent from a concept to IPO. Her passion for people was met with a new passion for technology. In 2010, when she became a partner at Strategic Brand Consulting, helping businesses accelerate growth through sales and marketing. At ARIA NLG, she's currently working to bring customers a strategy-geared approach to their data through the power of natural language generation. Her driving force is family, and you'll find her cheering on her 3 kids and husband all weekend long at their various sporting activities. We do have a special treat for you guys here today. ARIA is giving away a $250 gift card to the best question asked. So go ahead and get your questions ready for Tom Moroney and Lyndsee. I'm going to bring them up on stage. And yes, $250 Amazon gift card will be provided to those who, to the person who asks the best question, which will be selected after the conference. Hello, Tom. Hello, Lyndsee. Pleasure to have you here today.
Hi, Kate. Thanks for having me.
Hello, Kate. Thank you. Lyndsee, hello.
Hello.
Hello. I'm going to hop off stage and I'll join you in about 15, 20 minutes to take some questions from the audience.
Great. Thanks, Kate. Well, what a great segue there from Bernard. Fantastic talk. And he talked about data literacy across the organization, even equipment monitoring and systems like digital twin, which Tom and I are both very familiar with. This talk really builds on what Bernard was speaking about, and we're going to be discussing the enablement of the articulate enterprise and the articulate oil and gas field. And that's really what Bernard was talking about. Great. He was talking about Shell. I didn't realize Bernard was going to be talking about Shell today. So that's pretty cool, Tom, because we're really lucky to have a Shell veteran in Tom with us today, who's been an oil and gas and energy expert for, should I name how many decades, Tom? 3 decades or more? So we're really lucky to have Tom today. Tom is certainly a pioneer and innovator in his own right, using technology to accelerate data understanding across companies like Shell and many others. So I'm really lucky to be here with you today, Tom. So thanks for joining us. Absolutely, Lyndsee. Look forward to the chat. Great. So a lot of great questions prepared for Tom and not a lot of time, so we'll get started. The impact that data specifically, Tom, has had in your area of expertise in oil and gas has certainly evolved over time, and we're seeing this across many industries. But Bernard was touching on this too, especially in oil and gas and energy. We've seen this evolution of data. We've seen lots of use cases where data understanding is mission critical, ranging from surveillance, TPR, total process reliability, equipment monitoring, supply chain, finance, and many, many more. What's changed specifically, Tom, in your opinion, specifically in the last 5 to 10 years in data in oil and gas and energy companies?
Great. Yeah, that's a great place to start, Lyndsee. The oil and gas industry that, as you mentioned, I have been a part of for 3.5 decades. A lot has changed, and a lot has changed with respect to data. But actually, it's always been an industry awash in data and information, right? Absolutely immersed in it. I've spent my 3.5 decades in the industry, in the engineering part of Royal Dutch Shell and another company in the upstream sector, where you're always talking about really two realms: the inflow realm, which is the subsurface primarily and the drilling of wells and the complexity of reservoirs and geology, and the outflow part of the outflow realm, which deals with the wellbore and then all of the processing equipment on the surface. So as you might imagine, there is just a tremendous amount of data that the industry has always immersed itself in. But clearly, over the last 10 years, even over the last 5 years, there have been things that have changed, right? Clearly, the volume of data has accelerated. The velocity of information and data coming in has certainly stepped up. The accuracy has improved. The explosion of devices, the mobility of data. So everyone in the organization has a device or multiple devices. They're accessing a massive amounts of information at any point in time. I think the other thing, that has changed without getting at this stage into, the evolution of storage technologies and so forth, but, and Bernard made this point, the concept of data literacy certainly has evolved on the stage as a key enabler, and the notion of thinking in a more structured manner about our data, right? So there are measured pieces of data, there are calculated, there are interpreted pieces of data, and how one goes about processing all of that has to be thought about differently. So that would be another area that has certainly changed and improved quite dramatically over the last decade, 5 years, and is still evolving today.
Yeah, well, you gave a great precursor to the next two questions. So we'll separate the two pieces out so that we can discuss them separately. But the next question is, how has this centralization, availability, and quantity impacted the ability to understand data? We have all this data. It's all in one place. It's available. Now what? So how has that impacted that? And then my follow-on, we're going to dive into data literacy a bit.
Right. So I might start with the second and just merge the two together. So the notion of centralization of data and the storage of data, and whether you're talking about on-prem or in the cloud or edge analytics, et cetera, it all comes down to fundamentally two aspects: having sound data models and integration, right? So it's not simply centralization, but it's the ability to integrate that data that's going to ultimately drive sense making and actually is going to move you along the data literacy maturity curve, right? Now, when I'm talking about data models, again, the industry is awash in data, and each engineering discipline sort of has its own wealth of data, whether you're talking about geologists or reservoir engineers dealing with rock properties of the reservoir or the fluid properties of the fluids contained in the reservoir, the well designs. And so as you work your way through this very complex system, both from an inflow and an outflow perspective, understanding the underlying data model, in other words, how the data is going to get pieced and integrated together in a way that's going to allow the end user to interpret and make sense out of what that information is telling them, is fundamentally key. So centralization is absolutely critical to the extent that it drives a data model strategy, and that has to be supported by how you integrate and ultimately consume and use the data into decision making, which was another point Bernard had made.
Yeah. And that's really, are you data literate? Do you understand the data? So that kind of follows on to, we're talking about this, this decision-making capability. And in order to make a really smart decision, you've got to be data literate, understand that data, be able to do that very quickly, right? We talk about speed, accuracy, consistency, which plays into, do you have the right models in place? Do we have a data dictionary? Do we understand? Is that consistent across the organization? One person might understand it differently than the other. So data explanation has to be consistent. It's got to be fast. But translating these concepts into something we've discussed, Tom, prior to today, you called it the maturity of decision making, and I really loved your terminology there when we were talking as we were prepping for this session. All these concepts of data literacy, data understanding. We say all these words, but what does it really mean to have that mature capability of decision making. And can you elaborate on what that means to you, and specifically in your area of expertise, this term maturity of decision making?
Okay. Yeah. And I'll do that, Lyndsee, by first starting with a concept of value loop, because I think this is fundamental. And at the end of the day, the winners, the ones that are ultimately going to drive value for a company, for their shareholders, are the ones that can drive value out of their data, right? So we're not just in this to collect data, to have it show up on, to outfit a piece of equipment with all kinds of IoT devices, which we can now do today, and have it show up on devices all over the organization into anyone's hands, which is fantastic. But it is fundamentally about closing the value loop, right? And the value loop starts with understanding what is that asset that I'm trying to optimize, and that asset is going to drive everything that you're thinking about, your data models, the integration that has to happen. So your asset could be a well, it could be the entire oil field. You're trying to, again, to look at how that oil field needs to be further optimized with subsequent recovery mechanisms or infill drilling opportunities. The asset could be a specific reservoir, could be a piece of equipment. You've got your asset, then there's a data plan, right? And again, your data models support that plan. What data needs to be collected such that I can get the information I need to make the decisions. And I'll get back to decisions in a minute, because here's where we get to the maturity of your decision making, which is fundamentally where I'm driving to, right? But that decision leads to a set of plans, right? So you'll have some options that have to get evaluated, trade-offs made, and ultimately you'll execute that decision, right? Going all the way through that loop is how you drive value. It's how you bring value through the P&L to the bottom line. Now, the notion of how large can you make that loop, how much value can be captured, gets us to the question of data decision maturity, right? So is this a question of just understanding what happened, which could be important, but is a very small, a small decision to address and answer, right? What happened? Why did that well go offline? What needs to be done? But that single well might be actually a signal to a much bigger opportunity, right? Why did it happen, right? So can I move my maturity from not just what, but to why, right? So not simply descriptive, but more prescriptive set of decision making. And ultimately what I'm trying to get to is, what is the best that can happen, right? That's how I can really maximize that value loop and capture a lot of value, right? So what is that full optimization? How do I go from standard reporting, detecting anomalies in a complex system, all the way to statistical analysis, forecasting, predictive analytics, the things like Bernard was even hitting out with machine learning and AI, which are all technologies that can be introduced to further contextualize or drive up the contextualization of data and information, increasing the value that can be captured ultimately.
Yeah, well, you're talking too about concepts that we talk about every day at ARIA, which is to be really articulate, to be very literate, to really have knowledge and expertise. What happened? Why or how did that happen? So what, who cares? What's the context of that? And then what do I do next? What does that mean overall for our business? Not just specifically for this piece of equipment that I might need to, put on a new rotating schedule so that we get more life out of it. But then what does that mean to the bottom line financially? And pulling that all together as you pull the data together. So as far as I know, Tom, you were the first on the planet in terms of my knowledge bank to use natural language to initiate creating the articulate oil and gas field. So you've been an innovator to solve business problems with brand new innovative technology, which now has been around for quite some time. You've been using and aware of natural language generation for over a decade and understood the power of it very early on. So what does that mean? It's different to a lot of people. What does it mean to be articulate, have the articulate oil and gas field or the articulate oil and gas company? And what excites you most about technology that's really bridging that gap between data availability, centralized data, and then the ability to take intelligent action from that. Because I think that's a lot we were talking about with the concept of mature decision making. It's because you have that data there, because you have that knowledge accessibility, the democratized knowledge that's really allowing, a mature decision. So big loaded question there in terms of the articulate oil and gas field, but I think those concepts really tie to that mature decision making phrase that you use.
Right, and that's what intrigued me many years ago when we first reached out and began working with ARIA on NLG technology and how we could use that to augment many of the other analytics that we were layering into our, Lyndsee, you described what is the articulate oil and gas field, and that is really the essence of the question one needs to answer, right? As an organization, as a business unit, what is the sophistication of the intelligence that you want to drive, right, such that you have a fully articulated oil and gas field, right? An oil and gas field that is speaking to your end users, not where your engineers have to spend time collating information, trying to build models that may be relevant, may not be relevant, right? There's a lot of waste. What we found there was a tremendous amount of waste. In some cases, 60% of an engineer's time could be spent wading through, at the end of the day, useless information and data, right? So the sophistication of the intelligence that you want to drive through analytics, through the contextualization of the data into sense making, answers the question of what the articulate oil and gas field is. And I certainly believe NLG is one of the critical enabling technologies, that along with artificial intelligence, along with advanced analytics, can really step an organization towards answering that question for them. What is the sophistication of business intelligence that they want to drive day in and day out for their organization? And it becomes a much more richer environment, for the engineers, for the frontline folks out in the field to do their job.
Yeah, and I've seen pictures, but have never been there of what it feels like to be in the rooms with all those dashboards and alerts and bells going off, and it feels like it would be just wildly overwhelming to be able to make sense of all that in a short period of time when you're making mission critical decisions. So certainly it's come a long way, and it's gonna keep evolving and getting better and better. So thank you so much, Tom, for joining me here today and talking about data and NLG. And it's just been an absolute pleasure to chat with you live here at DATAcated. So Kate, I think we're ready to take some questions from the audience.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for this very insightful discussion. We have definitely more questions that we can handle at this point. I think an incentive helped, but also that the conversation was really interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into our very first question here from Poonam. And the question is, what are the most critical changes that we must make to face the future effectively in the field of data analytics in the oil and gas industry?
I think it gets to exactly the conversation Lyndsee and I was just having, right? It was continuing to drive the concepts of data literacy and, answering the question of what is the optimized articulate oil and gas field. And you can really, put in, any industry, insert any industry. I think there was a question earlier during Bernard's talk around HVAC. Well, I think you could place HVAC into there as well. But that really is the challenge, right? These last 5 years, this last decade, there's just been an explosion in technologies, on the storage side, on the analytics side, on the device side, on the concepts of mobility. Making sense of how that puzzle gets pieced together to answer the sophistication of intelligence that the organization needs to drive, right? And it's a creaming curve, right? You can certainly overdo it, but that truly, to me, is the challenge that the industry faces. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We've got another question here from Fadi, and he's asking, how could natural language generation help bridge the gap between data availability and decision making?
Well, certainly on decision making, NLG can help to accelerate closing that gap, right? Again, contextualizing the information so that you're not just looking at, as Lyndsee described, a dashboard with a whole bunch of yellow and red alerts. But if you knew that red alert that was appearing on that well was actually an indication of an event that had actually occurred 15 times over the last 6 months, you were on a trend, and you actually got a narrative that described that alert, right, contextualized overall in the performance of that well. Perhaps water breakthrough was imminent. What you would do as an engineer would be different if you had that full narrative versus just having the single red alert, right? If all you had was a single red alert, you would look to react and prevent that alert from getting worse, which again is probably gonna save something from breaking down, but you're not going to capture full value.
Yeah, absolutely. A narrative can definitely help in that situation. I'll move on to the next question here. So it's been said that we only use about 15 to 20% of the data gathered. I've been seeing this metric actually everywhere. How can the oil and gas industry better take advantage of more data being available?
Right. I think that's just the hard work of being clear around what your data literacy objectives have to be to drive decision making, right? And no one can answer that question except the business unit, right? The business unit in the organization has to be rigorously focused on what are those critical value drivers and what are the decisions that need to be made that ultimately capture the value, and then what is the information and only the information needed to address those decisions, right? Because there are lots of things that can be measured, and over nearly 4 decades in this industry, we capture a lot of data, and in many cases, it's not only that we're capturing too many variables that aren't even necessary, but the frequency at which we gather them and collect them and store them is again not necessary. So can you consolidate? Can you we did a lot of data conditioning in a big analytics program that I was a part of, such that we again only stored the minimum amount necessary to make the decision. So
all right, thank you for that. First of all, Kimberly says that this presentation was so worth the wait. So
no, that's good. Being the end of the day, so that's always helpful.
Yes.
She might win the prize. I'm kidding.
Kimberly. Ramdas is asking, how do you in oil and gas make sure that the analytics insights that is provided is actionable? And I guess you touched on this already with the narrative, right. But if you want to elaborate here.
No, I think I've addressed that question already. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. I'll move on to the next one. All right. So Amarachi is asking, how do you ensure that the models used in analyzing data recognize asset build and complexities to enhance proffering working solution as against a standardized model?
Oh, okay. So I believe he's referring to. It appears as if he's referring to, the as-built asset as opposed to the standardized model, and how do you make sure that the models used in your analytics recognize the as-built asset and their complexities. Yeah, I think that's that's got to be part of your whole data strategy that Bernard had spoken to. The concept of data models, and this point has to be addressed as part of that overall strategy. But I agree that the question here is a valid one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. We've got a question here for both Tom and Lyndsee here. So How can one be a responsible data generator apart from being a responsible data handler?
Well, I think there's some specifics there, Tom, for oil and gas in terms of data generator. I think we've seen that increase over the years, right? So from data generation, you're better poised to answer that one. Data handler, we certainly see it across multiple industries. It's got to be aggregated to make sense of it and to cross-correlate between data silos. You have to have it all in one place. And as you said, Tom, we've seen technologies that are helping companies do that now, which is great.
Right. Being a responsible generator of data and generator of information, again, is just being well trained and well versed in the concepts and the terminology. Right. Not all data is equal, as I mentioned. You have structured data, which could be measured, which could be calculated, which could be interpreted, and those are all different, right? So understanding the source of the data is absolutely critical. Then there's the whole category of unstructured data, reports, and so forth. So it's just being very, very rigorous, and it, ultimately it gets back to the data strategy of the company, and making sure it's being executed at the business unit level. One thing we didn't talk on is speak to is the concept of real-time data and information that and this is something that has always plagued the oil and gas industry. You would get real-time volume information and measurement information of well tests, but the actual final allocated volume of what was financially produced and accounted for and working interests were cut off of, wouldn't come for nearly a month later, right? So understanding that lag time and understanding the errors and the level of accuracy that you're dealing with, again, is you've got to have that built into your definitions and how you manage and handle the data. Otherwise, you can wind up using information and driving poor decision making. Right? We've all heard that. What's the old adage? Garbage in, garbage out.
Or goodness in, goodness out. That's another.
We want goodness in, goodness out.
Yes.
Yep.
Absolutely. So thank you for that, Tom and Lyndsee. We'll take one last question from the audience here. Lisa is asking, how do you meet the challenges such as traditional thinking associated with increasing data literacy that requires big culture changes in making the data important in business processes?
So I think the concept of anchoring ourselves, anchoring our organization around the concept of the value loop, which began with an asset, and then it moved. So there are four pieces to it, right? So at the top is the asset, and then understanding again the definition of the asset. And as I said, that could be an entire oil field, it could be a single well, it could be a single reservoir. So there's a scale associated with the asset. Along with that asset would be the data. What data would be collected on that asset? And again, that there would be a data plan, there would be a strategy, there would be a model, right? So what you might have rock data you were collecting, fluid data you were collecting, how all of that got pieced together. The accuracy of each of those measured variables had to be known or at least understood, because then they went into your models, right? And then that drove the options and the interpretation and what plans you would ultimately look at. And then ultimately you would pick, right? You would have some optimization criteria. You were optimizing on production, you were optimizing on value, you were looking to lower cost. And then that's would ultimately drive what you actually executed, what you actually performed. And that might actually cause some change to the asset at the end of the day, right? Increased production. You might wind up adding a couple of wells to the field, right? And so you would continue. But if you thought about if the business unit could get organized around the concept of a value loop, nearly everyone in the business unit in the organization touched that loop at some point, right? So they would be touching that and understanding how they interacted with either the data side of that value loop or the decision-making side, right? The plans, the action, the execution side of that value loop, allowed the organization to get aligned in a way that they all saw the importance and criticality of data fueling business decisions.
Got it. Thank you so much for that, Tom. And Lyndsee, anything to add before we wrap up our conversation here?
No, it's been fun. I have the comments up. Somebody asked Tom what kind of car you drive. They were so glad to have you here. It's been great to see. I've been watching the comments scroll. You guys are a funny crowd, and a pleasure to be here. And I can't wait to do another event with you, Kate. This is a lot of fun. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. Yes, Tom, I've gotten a lot of private messages about, is Tom in a car? And I'm like, yes, this is dedication.
I am in a vehicle. It has been obviously a stationary vehicle. Yes, so safety has been at the foremost top of mind here. But in order to have I'm a bit of a remote location up in Maine. So this enabled me to get to some good IT infrastructure. So.
Well, thank you so much for making the trip. And I loved your comment about driving to success as you were in a car. I'm like, yes.
Yes, there you go. Literally.
Thank you both so much. This is really an insightful session. Definitely worth the wait. I really appreciate you both jumping on.
Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Kate.